Most stories about men who lose everything abroad end with the flight home. This one starts there, or close enough to it, because the flight home wasn't the ending. It was the beginning of a much quieter, much harder story, one that doesn't involve a foreign country at all, one that unfolds instead in a spare bedroom in a modest house in Hull, at a dinner table where nobody quite knows what to say about why Grandad lives in the office. The room is fine, I want to say that first, because my son Michael has never once made me feel unwelcome, not with a word, not with a look, not in the 8 months I've been living here. It's his old home office, the one he used to run his small accounting practice out of before he moved everything into a proper office space in town, and it's got a decent bed, a window that catches the morning light, and enough space for the few boxes of belongings that survived the whole business, which is more than I can say for most of what I built across 71 years. I pay him £200 a month, and we both pretend that's rent, and we both know, without either of us ever saying it out loud, that it's really something closer to dignity maintenance, a fee I insist on paying so that neither of us has to use the word charity. I spent 42 years running a hardware shop on a corner in Hull, the kind of shop that doesn't really exist anymore, the kind where regulars came in for a specific size of screw and stayed 20 minutes talking about the football. I took it over from my own father when I was 26, built it up steadily rather than spectacularly, weathered 2 recessions and the arrival of a big home improvement chain 3 miles away that everyone said would finish me off and somehow never quite did, mostly because people in that part of Hull liked being known by name when they walked through a door. I knew half my customers' children's names, their dogs' names, whose boiler had packed in the previous winter. It was a small life, in the way people mean that dismissively sometimes, but it never once felt small to me while I was living it. My first wife, Michael's mother Diane, and I split when Michael was 14, an ordinary enough divorce, no great scandal in it, just 2 people who'd married too young and grown into different shapes. The way I understand happens to a great many marriages that start out with more hope than compatibility. Diane moved to Leeds not long after, remarried a decent enough man within a few years, and I raised Michael mostly on my own from there, alongside running the shop, learning to cook proper meals rather than relying on whatever Diane had always managed, learning to sit through parents' evenings alone without feeling the specific loneliness of an empty chair beside me. I like to think, whatever else I've gotten wrong since, that I got that part right. He's a decent, careful man, married to a lovely woman named Rachel, with 2 kids of his own now, Poppy and Ollie, and watching him build that life, steady and warm, in exactly the ways I'd hoped for him, has been, honestly, the proudest achievement of my entire life, prouder than the shop ever was, prouder than anything I've built with my own 2 hands. I sold the shop at 68, to a young couple who'd been renting the flat above it for years, and had always talked about wanting to run something of their own someday. And I remember the sale closing for £230,000, a figure that felt, at the time, like the entire physical weight of 42 years finally converted into something portable, something I could actually hold in my hands rather than measure out 1 till count at a time. I'd been alone for 6 years by then, Diane long remarried, my own social circle thinned out the way it does for men who spend their whole lives working rather than cultivating friendships outside of work. Most of my old mates from school either moved away or, in a couple of sadder cases, passed on entirely, leaving me with a Christmas card list that had grown noticeably shorter with each passing year, without my ever quite noticing the pattern until it was well underway. I found myself, in that first retired year, restless in a way I hadn't expected, the shop's absence leaving a hole in my days I didn't know how to fill with woodworking or golf, the usual prescriptions everyone seemed to recommend, none of which ever managed to occupy more than a few hours of any given week, leaving long, empty stretches of afternoon that I filled, more often than I care to admit, simply walking the aisles of shops I no longer owned, out of some habit I couldn't quite let go of. I met Faith through a mutual friend of a friend, a fellow Hull retiree named Gordon, who'd been going out to the Philippines for years, and finally convinced me to join him on a trip, more out of curiosity than any real romantic intention, mostly because I had nothing pulling me back to Hull for those particular 3 weeks, and Gordon's enthusiasm for the place had been building in me, conversation by conversation, pint by pint, for the better part of a year. Faith was 32 at the time, working as a receptionist at the hotel where I was staying in Naga, and I want to say plainly that what drew me to her wasn't some fantasy about a younger woman, though I understand why anyone hearing the numbers might assume that. It was the specific way she managed her own family's needs alongside her job, the calm, practiced competence of a woman juggling more responsibility than her modest wage should have required of her, the way she talked about her nieces and nephews, with real warmth in her voice, whenever they came up in conversation. I recognized something of myself in her, or thought I did, the same instinct I'd carried through raising Michael alone, holding a family together through sheer steady effort, and that recognition felt, at 68, sitting across from her at that hotel's small breakfast table, like the rarest thing in the world. We married a year after that first meeting, and I want to be honest, that Michael had real reservations, expressed carefully, the way a good son expresses concern without lecturing, sitting across from me at his own kitchen table, with Rachel quiet beside him during that conversation, both of them clearly having discussed beforehand how to raise it without sounding like they were trying to control my life. "Dad, I just want you to go in with your eyes open. This is a big life change at your age." I told him I understood the risks, that I'd read plenty about scams and gold diggers, and men who'd lost everything, entire forums full of cautionary tales I'd genuinely worked through before ever proposing, and that I felt confident I knew the difference between that and what Faith and I had. I believed that completely. I want that on the record, because I think it matters to the rest of this story, that I wasn't a fool walking in blind. I was a careful man who genuinely believed he'd done his homework, who'd insisted on proper legal documentation for everything, precisely because I'd read enough warnings to know that was important. We built a house together outside Naga, a proper house, 4 bedrooms, on land that Faith's family helped us secure at what seemed, at the time, like a fair local price, coming to roughly £90,000 once the construction was finished, materials and labor both, a process that took the better part of a year and that I actually enjoyed, in its way, visiting the site regularly, watching walls go up, feeling something of the same satisfaction I used to feel watching a well-organized shop shelf come together. I want to be fair here and say the house itself was never the problem in the way these stories usually go. It was legally in both our names, properly documented, the kind of transparent arrangement I'd insisted on precisely because I'd read enough warnings to know that was important. The problems, such as they were, came in smaller, steadier increments after that, the kind that don't show up clearly until you finally sit down and add the whole picture together, which I didn't do properly until it was already far too late to matter. Faith's younger sister, Marites, wanted to open an internet cafe in the town center, a genuinely reasonable small business idea in an area where not every family had reliable home internet, and I financed the whole thing, roughly £18,000 for the space, the computers, the initial setup costs, walking through the whole proposal with Marites myself over several evenings, genuinely impressed by how carefully she'd thought through the numbers, or so it seemed to me at the time. I told myself, and genuinely believed, that this was exactly the kind of thing a good husband does for his wife's family, an investment in people I was building a life alongside, rather than a handout to strangers. The same instinct that had once led me to hire local teenagers at the shop, rather than turning away anyone who came in asking for work. The cafe did modest business for about a year before quietly failing, undercut by cheaper mobile data becoming available across the region, faster than any of us had anticipated, and I never once saw a full accounting of where the failure had actually left the books. Never pushed hard enough for one, telling myself that pressing too firmly on family finances wasn't the kind of husband I wanted to be. Beyond the cafe, there was the steady, unremarkable drain of ordinary family support that I'd agreed to without ever quite calculating its total shape. A monthly contribution to Faith's parents that started at a modest figure and crept upward twice over those 2 years, without any formal conversation about it, School fees for two nieces I'd met perhaps 3 times each. A nephew's motorcycle repair that arrived as an urgent one-off request and somehow recurred twice more before the year was out. A cousin's wedding contribution that felt, individually, like exactly the kind of generosity a comfortable retired man could easily afford. Each request, taken on its own, felt entirely reasonable, the kind of thing any decent husband would agree to without much fuss. And I want to be honest, that I don't regret the impulse behind most of them even now. What I regret is never once, across those 2 years, sitting down and totaling the actual monthly outflow the way I should have, the way I would have insisted any young shop assistant do with the till at the end of a busy Saturday, cross-checking every entry against the receipts before anyone was allowed to go home. I trusted the shape of the life we'd built together more than I trusted the numbers underneath it. And that trust, more than any single betrayal, is what actually emptied the account. The marriage itself didn't end over money, not directly, and I think that's the part people find hardest to understand when I tell this story. It ended, slowly, over the ordinary erosions of a relationship between two people who, I came to understand far too late, had built their connection around a specific set of roles, rather than around each other. I was the provider. Faith managed the household and the family obligations that came with it. And once the money started running thin, once I started gently pushing back on requests I'd once granted without question, actually sitting down for the first time with our accounts and suggesting we needed to slow the outflow, the roles that had held us together started to feel, to both of us I think, less like a marriage and more like a business arrangement whose terms had quietly changed without either party formally renegotiating them. I remember the specific evening the shift became undeniable, a few months before the separation itself, when I raised, gently I thought, the question of whether we could pause new family contributions for a while, until I understood our finances more clearly. Sitting at that same kitchen table, with a printed bank statement between us, that I'd spent the better part of an afternoon preparing, highlighting entries the way I used to highlight discrepancies in a supplier's invoice. Faith's face did something I hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, more like a door quietly closing somewhere behind her eyes. And she said, "You've never had to choose between your family and your husband before, Norman. I don't think you understand what you're asking me to do." I didn't have a good answer for that at the time, and I'm not certain I have one even now, some years later, turning it over the way I still occasionally do on quiet evenings, my own printed statement still, somewhere, folded into a box of old paperwork I've never quite managed to throw away. Faith asked for a separation about 20 months into the marriage, calmly, almost matter-of-factly, sitting across from me at our own kitchen table, with an expression I couldn't quite read at the time, and have spent a great deal of time since trying to understand. Her hands folded in front of her, the way they'd been folded that very first morning at the hotel breakfast table 2.5 years earlier. "Norman, I don't think this is working the way either of us hoped. I think we both know that." I asked her, my voice shaking more than I'd have liked, whether any of it had been real, whether the 2 years meant anything at all, beyond the money I'd put into the house, and the cafe, and her family. She didn't answer that with anger or denial. She just said, quietly, "I think I loved the life we could build together. I'm not sure that's different from loving you, but maybe it is. I don't know anymore either, Norman. I've turned that answer over more times than I can count since, because there's an honesty in it I've never quite been able to dismiss, even now, even after everything it cost me. Under Philippine law, and I want to be precise about this, because it matters to how the rest of this story unfolded, the house was legally, fairly, unambiguously half Faith's, properly documented from the start, exactly the way I'd insisted on. There was no fraud in the property itself, no forged signature, no hidden clause I'd failed to read. I'd done that part correctly, checked and rechecked with an independent solicitor before ever signing anything, precisely the kind of due diligence I'd have demanded of any supplier trying to sell into my shop decades earlier. What I hadn't accounted for was simpler and, in its way, more devastating, that a fair 50-50 split of an asset built almost entirely from my own money, still left me walking away with roughly half of a house I could neither easily sell from abroad nor comfortably continue living in, while the cafe money, the family support, the 2 years of steady outflow, none of that came back to me at all, because none of it had ever been structured as anything other than a gift. I engaged a lawyer in Naga, a careful, patient woman named Corazon, who walked me through the actual mechanics of the settlement over several difficult meetings in her small, cluttered office, papers stacked in careful towers along one wall, a window unit rattling in the corner against the afternoon heat. And I remember her telling me plainly, without unkindness, tapping the property title spread out between us, "Mr. Radcliffe, you did many things correctly here that most foreign husbands don't. The house is properly documented. That protects you. What it can't protect you from is everything you gave away outside that document." I sold my half-interest in the house back to Faith, at what Corazon assured me was a genuinely fair market valuation, verified independently rather than simply taken at Faith's word, and after legal fees, after the accumulated smaller debts I'd taken on in that final difficult year, trying to keep the whole arrangement afloat. A personal loan I'd quietly taken against my UK pension to cover a shortfall in the cafe's second year that I'd never told Michael about. After 2 years of steady, invisible drain I'd never properly tallied, I found myself standing in a departure lounge in Manila with £4,100 to my name, the entire remaining balance of a life that had once, briefly, been worth $230,000. I called Michael from that departure lounge, and I want to describe that call honestly, because it's the moment this whole story actually turns on. More than the marriage, more than the house, more than any single financial decision across those 2 years. I sat on a hard plastic chair near a gate that wouldn't board for another 3 hours, the announcement board flickering above me, other travelers moving past with their own ordinary luggage and their own ordinary lives, and I dialed my son's number with a hand that wasn't entirely steady, rehearsing, absurdly, what I might say, the way you rehearse an apology you know won't actually cover the size of what you're apologizing for, running through half a dozen opening lines and discarding every single one of them before the call even connected. "Dad, everything all right?" Michael's voice, when he picked up, carried the specific alertness of a son who knows, instinctively, that a call at this hour means something's wrong. Background noise of what sounded like Rachel and the kids somewhere in the house behind him, the clatter of dinner plates, Ollie's voice raised about something entirely unrelated, an ordinary Tuesday evening interrupted by a phone call he hadn't been expecting. I told him, as plainly as I could manage, that the marriage had ended, that the money was mostly gone, that I was flying home in a few hours with almost nothing left to my name, and that I didn't quite know what I was asking him for, only that I didn't have anywhere else to go. There was a silence on the line, brief, no more than 2 or 3 seconds, but long enough that I felt every one of those seconds land somewhere in my chest like a small, separate blow, each one carrying its own particular weight of shame. Then he said, "Of course, Dad. Come home. We'll sort it out." He said it so fast, so completely without hesitation, that it broke something open in me, sitting in that plastic chair, that the entire collapse of the marriage hadn't managed to break. I'd expected, I realize now, at least a beat of calculation, some audible working through of what this would mean for his own household, his own finances, his own plans. There wasn't one. He simply said yes, immediately, the way I'd said yes to him 1,000 times across his own childhood, without ever once treating it as a decision that required deliberation. I flew home 3 days later, and Michael and Rachel picked me up from the airport themselves, rather than letting me take the train, both of them waiting at arrivals with a warmth that felt, in my particular state that day, almost unbearable to receive. Rachel hugged me before Michael did, actually, which surprised me, and said, simply, "We're glad you're home, Norman," using my name rather than any formal title, the way she always had since the very first time Michael had introduced us, years earlier, and I remember standing there in that arrivals hall, 70 years old, everything I owned in 2 suitcases, trying not to fall apart in front of my own grandchildren, who'd come along for the ride and were more interested, thankfully, in the airport's vending machines and the general spectacle of the terminal than in whatever was happening on their grandfather's face. Poppy, 5 at the time, tugged at my sleeve almost immediately and asked whether I'd brought her anything from the Philippines, entirely unbothered by the 2 suitcases or my evident exhaustion, and answering that ordinary, entirely reasonable question, digging through my carry-on for the small souvenir I'd thought to buy in the Manila terminal shops, a little woven bracelet in bright colors that she immediately wanted tied onto her wrist, right there in arrivals, was the first thing in days that had felt genuinely, uncomplicatedly good. The first few weeks in Michael's old home office were strange, in a way I hadn't fully anticipated, a specific, disorienting mix of gratitude and grief that I found harder to sit with than I'd expected. I was grateful, genuinely, overwhelmingly grateful, for a son who'd taken me in without a moment's hesitation, for a daughter-in-law who set an extra place at the table every single night, as though it had always been there, who never once, in all these months, made me feel like an inconvenience, folded into an already busy household. And underneath that gratitude ran a steady current of something closer to shame, the specific shame of a man who'd spent his entire working life being the one who provided, who paid for his son's university without loans, who covered every birthday, every school trip, every unexpected expense across Michael's own childhood without a second thought, and who'd have laughed, 20 years earlier, at the idea that he'd end up paying £200 a month to sleep in that same son's converted office. I insisted on the £200 almost immediately, before Michael had even finished showing me where the towels were kept, standing in the doorway of what would become my room, with my 2 suitcases still unopened behind me. I remember him pushing back gently. "Dad, you don't need to pay me anything, seriously." I told him I needed to, that it wasn't really about the money, that I needed some structure to this arrangement, or I wasn't sure I'd be able to look at myself in the mirror each morning, that a man who'd spent 42 years insisting his own customers pay a fair price for a fair product wasn't about to start accepting charity from his own son without some kind of exchange attached to it, however symbolic. He relented, eventually, though not before we'd gone back and forth on the figure itself twice, Michael initially suggesting a token £50 that I refused outright as insufficiently real. I've noticed, in the months since, that the money sits untouched in a savings account he set up specifically for it, something Rachel mentioned once in passing over washing up, apparently intending it, eventually, for the grandchildren rather than any household expense, which somehow made the whole arrangement feel both more bearable and more painful at once, a fiction we were both maintaining for each other's sake that had quietly become, in its own way, a small inheritance after all, just traveling in a direction neither of us had planned for. There's a particular moment that happens most weeks now, usually on a Sunday, that I've come to think of as the real shape of this story, more than the marriage, more than the house, more than the £4,100 I arrived home with. My granddaughter Poppy, 7 years old and entirely without the tact adults slowly learn to develop, asked at dinner a few months back, in the perfectly ordinary tone children use for perfectly ordinary questions, spooning peas onto her plate without looking up, "Why does Granddad live in the office, and not in a proper house like everyone else's granddad?" The table went quiet for a beat, that specific, careful silence adults produce around children's honest questions, Rachel's fork pausing halfway to her mouth, Michael's jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, and Michael answered, gently, that Granddad's house situation had changed, and he was living with us now, while he figured out what came next, an answer that satisfied Poppy completely, and moved on within seconds to whether there was more pudding. I sat there through that silence, feeling something I don't have an entirely clean word for. Not quite humiliation, not quite grief, something closer to the specific ache of watching your own life get summarized, accurately and kindly, into a sentence a 7-year-old can understand, and immediately set aside without a second thought, the way only a child's mind can move that quickly from one thing to the next, unburdened by the weight adults instinctively attach to such moments. I've noticed other things since moving in. Small things that Michael would never point out directly, but that I've pieced together on my own. The way you piece together a pattern you're not supposed to be looking for. A holiday to Portugal that he and Rachel had apparently been planning before I arrived, mentioned once, early on, over dinner in that easy, forward-looking way couples discuss trips they're excited about, and never mentioned again, quietly shelved, I suspect, though neither of them has ever said so outright, partly, I imagine, because of the added cost of an extra person in the household, and partly, I suspect, because leaving me alone in the house for a week felt, to both of them, like something they weren't quite ready to do, whether out of genuine concern or simple habit formed over these past months of my being underfoot. I found a holiday brochure for the Algarve in the recycling one evening, months after it should have been thrown away already, curled at the edges from sitting under other paper, and I've never asked about it, because I'm not sure either of us could survive the conversation with any dignity and tact, mine least of all. I called Gordon, my old friend from Hull, the one who'd first taken me out to the Philippines all those years ago, about 4 months into living with Michael, mostly because I needed to say the whole thing out loud, to someone who wasn't directly living inside the consequences of it with me, someone who could listen, without also having to quietly absorb the cost of what I was describing. He listened without much interruption, letting me talk myself through the whole arc of it, the marriage, the settlement, the phone call from the departure lounge, occasionally just saying, "Go on," or, "and then," in that quiet way old friends have of keeping a conversation moving. And when I finished, he said, quietly, "Norman, I've known you 30 years. You built that shop with nothing but your own 2 hands, and never once asked anyone for a favor you didn't earn first. This isn't who you are. This is just where you've ended up." I told him I appreciated the sentiment, but that the arithmetic of where I'd ended up didn't much care what kind of man I'd been on the way there. That a good man could still be a foolish one in one particular corner of his life, without the 2 facts canceling each other out. He didn't have an answer for that, and I don't think there is one, not really, though I've held on to the kindness of the attempt more than I let on to him at the time. I think about Faith less than people probably expect, given everything, and when I do think about her, it's rarely with the anger I assumed I'd feel in those first raw weeks after the departure lounge. I think, instead, about that final conversation at our kitchen table, about her uncertain answer to whether any of it had been real, and I've come to believe, across the months since, that the honest answer sits somewhere I've had to learn to be at peace with, rather than resolve cleanly one way or the other. I don't think Faith set out to deceive me the way some of the men I've since read about online describe their own experiences, the calculated, cold operators some of these forums describe. I think 2 people built a life together, around roles that suited both of them for a while, and when the resources that made those roles sustainable ran thin, the whole structure came apart, not through malice exactly, but through a kind of quiet, mutual disappointment that neither of us had the tools or the honesty to address, while there was still something left to save. What sits harder with me than Faith, if I'm honest, isn't the marriage at all. It's the specific, quiet grief of watching my own son absorb a version of my old age I never once imagined for him, watching him decline a holiday he can't mention in front of me, watching him set up a savings account for money he doesn't need but accepts anyway because he understands, better than I gave him credit for before all this happened, that my insistence on paying it is really about something else entirely. I spent 42 years building a shop specifically so that Michael would never have to worry about money the way I'd watched my own father worry about it, counting coppers at the end of a bad week, deciding which bill could wait another fortnight. I retired with £230,000, specifically so that whatever I didn't spend on my own later years would eventually flow to him and to Poppy and to her younger brother Ollie, a small cushion I'd always imagined arriving quietly, unremarked, the way good inheritances are supposed to arrive, tucked into a solicitor's letter years from now, rather than announced or discussed. Instead, the flow reversed entirely, and I've had to sit with the particular, humbling truth that the inheritance I'm actually leaving my son, for now at least, is myself. an extra mouth at his table, an extra body in his home office, a father who needs looking after in exactly the way he once looked after me. Nappies and school runs and worried phone calls, all somehow folded backwards into the opposite direction from where I always assumed they'd travel. I've started, slowly, trying to make myself useful in ways that don't cost Michael anything beyond patience. Picking Poppy and Ollie up from school twice a week, standing at the gates among the mothers and the occasional other grandparent, learning their names in a way that reminded me, more than I expected, of standing behind my own shop counter learning the names of regulars decades earlier, exchanging the same small, ordinary pleasantries about weather and traffic that used to fill the quiet stretches of a slow Tuesday morning at the shop. I've taken to handling small repairs around the house that used to be the kind of thing I did professionally, without a second thought. A dripping tap, a sticking door, the little maintenance tasks that Michael, a good accountant but no tradesman, has always struggled with on his own, standing beside me while I work sometimes, handing me tools with the slightly baffled respect of a man watching a skill he never developed himself. It's not the same as leaving him money. I understand that plainly, and I don't imagine either of us is confused about the difference in weight between a fixed tap and 230,000 pounds. But it's something, a way of contributing that doesn't require an account balance I no longer have, and I've noticed, these past few months, that it started to matter to me more than I expected it to. This smaller, steadier way of being useful to the people I love, rather than the larger, more comfortable way I'd always assumed I'd be able to offer them. I don't know, even now, exactly what the rest of my life looks like from here. My pension covers most of my own needs, modestly, and I'm looking, slowly, at small rented flats nearby, one-bedroom places, above shops not unlike the one I used to run myself, close enough to still see Poppy and Ollie regularly. Once I've saved enough from that modest pension to manage a deposit and the first few months without leaning on anyone else's generosity to do it, a process that I've calculated, with the same care I once applied to a shop's monthly accounts, will take somewhere between 14 and 18 months at my current rate of saving. Michael tells me there's no rush, every time I bring it up, sitting across from me with a patience that never once wavers, and I believe he means it completely, which somehow makes the timeline feel both less urgent and more important to me at once. A strange contradiction I haven't fully worked out how to sit with comfortably. I want to leave that office not because I'm not wanted in it, but because some part of me still needs to prove, to myself more than to anyone else, that a man who built a shop from nothing at 26 can still, at 71, build something small and steady enough to stand on his own 2 feet again. Even if it never again looks anything like the life I once thought I'd built for good. Even if the flat I eventually find is smaller than any room I've occupied since I was a young man with nothing but a borrowed van and a father's business waiting for me to grow into it. The room is still fine. All these months later, Michael still says of course whenever I ask about anything, still faster than the moment strictly requires, whether it's borrowing his car or asking if I can join him and the kids for a Saturday football match. And most Sundays, when Poppy asks some perfectly ordinary question about why Grandad lives in the office, I've started answering it myself now, before Michael has to, telling her, as simply and honestly as I can manage for a 7-year-old, that Grandad made some choices that didn't work out the way he'd hoped, and that her dad was kind enough to help him while he figures out the next part. She usually nods, satisfied, and asks about pudding. Ollie, younger still, and less interested in the whole question, mostly just wants to know if I'll help him build something out of his construction set afterward, which I always do, sitting on the office floor with pieces spread across the carpet, feeling, in those particular half hours, more like myself than I have in almost any other moment since coming home. I've come to think there's something almost instructive in that, in watching a child accept an honest, unadorned account of failure and simply move forward without needing it dressed up as anything grander, without needing the story softened into something more flattering to the man at the center of it. I'm still learning to do the same thing myself, most days, one Sunday dinner at a time, one small repair at a time, one modest installment toward a deposit at a time, learning, slowly and imperfectly, that a life doesn't stop being worth living, simply because it's ended up smaller and stranger than the one you'd carefully planned for, only different, and only God willing, still capable of being rebuilt one honest brick at a time, the way I once built everything else.